Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited you could be here because today we have like one of the best podcasters of all time on the show with us today. And he's actually going to reveal what he's learned in a decade plus of doing his show that can help you actually launch a successful podcast. So I'm super excited. So with us today is John Lee Dumas. Now, John is famously known as JLD, and he's the electrifying host of Entrepreneurs on Fire, a podcast that has ignited the entrepreneur journey of millions since 2012. Now, with over 3,000 interviews under his belt, JLD has featured icons like Tony Robbins, Seth Godin, and Tim Ferriss, offering listeners unparalleled insights into the world of entrepreneurship. Now, JLD's journey is as dynamic as his podcast. From serving as an Army officer to navigating careers in real estate and corporate finance, his diverse experiences have shaped his unique approach to success. The electric background fuels his passion for empowering entrepreneurs, making him a beacon of inspiration to many. Now, beyond podcasting, JLD is a best-selling author with his book, The Common Path to Uncommon Success, where he shares the blueprint to achieving financial freedom and personal fulfillment. Through his engaging storytelling and actionable advice, he continues to set the entrepreneurial world ablaze one episode at a time. John, thanks for joining us today.
Well, TC, I'm fired up to be here. I'm usually coming at you from my very posh Puerto Rican studio, which looks a lot like yours with a nice backdrop and stuff. I'm actually on vacation in Maine right now. You can see a little backdrop for me here. So I decided I'll come at you with a little bit of a different studio. It's more of an El Natural. So I hope the audio quality is okay, but I can promise you one thing, the value is going to be high.
I love that. I love it. And I love your backdrop. I thought that was fake.
It's real, baby.
So what started you to launch down this journey? What started you in the very beginning of launching your own podcast?
Well, you mentioned my military service. So I went to college on an Army scholarship, and immediately upon graduation, I was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army. I spent 4 years active duty. I was a tank commander in places like Iraq, Fort Riley, Kansas, Fort Knox, Kentucky. And it was a pretty intense 4 years where I learned a lot about leading men in combat, about experiencing devastating loss and stressful situations. And I think one of the best takeaways that I had from that specifically military experience was perspective, because your worst day as an entrepreneur is still not nearly as bad as having to face the loss of one of your soldiers. And I had to do that 4 times actually during my 13-month tour of duty in Iraq. So even when I have a bad day as an entrepreneur, as a podcaster, I'm able to keep things in perspective, which I think a lot of people are not able to do successfully, which is why they struggle so much on an emotional roller coaster. And don't get me wrong, I have my ups and I have my downs. I have good days and bad days, but I really do just always harken back to that perspective and try to keep things in that good light of, listen, things could be a lot worse. And by the way, this too shall pass. And I think that phrase is important on both ends of the spectrum. It's going to pass when you're having a bad day. It's going to pass when you're having the best day of your life. So appreciate the good and don't dwell on the bad. And so post-military, I tried a bunch of things, corporate finance, commercial real estate. I went to law school, and none of it really excited me. It wasn't like the life that I wanted to live. And that's what led me to podcasting, because I started reading all the right books, business books by Napoleon Hill, like Think and Grow Rich, and all those epic ones that a lot of people have heard about and read about over the years. And those books really led me to an understanding that we actually are in control of our lives. We are in control of our destiny. And if we really focus on one major thing, we really have a great chance of success. And that one thing, by the way, is an Albert Einstein quote, which is, try not to become a person of success, but rather a person of value. If you focus on that one thing, be a person of value, you're going to win. Like, Ty, you asked me before we started this episode, John, what do you want to get out of this episode? My answer was nothing. But what I want to give in this episode is value, because I know if I do that, that's going to benefit everybody, people listening, myself, Ty, the whole equation. And that's what makes the world go round, is by providing value. And so many people are just chasing success. And at the end of the day, if they look in the mirror and you ask them the question, what are you providing to people on a value spectrum, they won't have a good answer for you. And by the way, I was guilty of that for almost 32 years. But when I launched Entrepreneurs on Fire, I said, I'm going to just be a person of value. I'm going to give to the world a free, valuable podcast interview of an amazing entrepreneur every single day. And I'm just going to let that value be out there. And I hope I can turn that at some point into a successful business that generates revenue. Because let's be honest, we all need to generate revenue in some way, shape, or form, because that's what makes the world go round as well. So that was my journey into podcasting, and I hope I didn't bore anybody.
No, that was exciting. But so many people, and I don't know the statistics. You probably do better than I do. So many people try this and fail, and so I'm interested. Like, what did you do early on? And I've heard you on stages and given some of the tips, which I still adopted, right off the gate and still use today. But what are some of the tips that you would give somebody that's just starting to help them actually get into that small percentage of people that launch podcasts that actually succeed?
Here's a problem with that vast majority of podcasters that you mentioned that do fail. And by the way, they don't all fail immediately, because you have typically this initial success because you're just starting, it's new, it's fresh, you're excited. But then so often there is that inevitable failure, that pod fading that happens for such a large majority of people. And it's really for one simple reason: they're looking at people, frankly, like myself and like other successful podcasters, and they're saying, look at what John's doing. Look at what person X is doing. Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, fill in the blank. I'm going to do that. And guess what? The world does not need a pale, weak imitation of other people doing what other people are already doing great and have been doing great for a long period of time. I've now been doing this for 12 years, for 4,384 episodes. Of course, right now, I'm a better interviewer than somebody that's starting a podcast interviewing entrepreneurs, because they just started. I was terrible 4,400 episodes ago, and I'm pretty darn good now because I've been doing it for so long at such a high quantity and quality. And that is so key. So many people are just copying. They're a pale, weak imitation of others. What they need to do if they want to win is they're going to say, what does the world actually need? What is a niche that I can fill in the podcasting space that actually needs to be filled? Because it is the solution to a real problem in this world. That's a key phrase there. It's a solution to a real problem that, by the way, is not being already solved at a fantastic level, because you don't want to be going against massive competition day one. So how do you identify that? How do you find the niche that's been undiscovered or ignored? How do you fill a void that hasn't yet been filled? You need to identify that within yourself. And there's a number of ways to go about it. I'll take you through my journey very, very quickly. I wanted to podcast. Okay, that's a very broad, big idea. So I niched down from there. I said, I want to podcast in the business sector. That was about, at the time, 800 podcasts. That was back in 2012. That's a massive pool. So I said, where's a smaller pool that I actually have a chance of succeeding? Well, what about entrepreneurship? Okay, there's about 200 podcasts on entrepreneurship. What about people that just interview entrepreneurs? Okay, there were 8 shows that strictly interviewed entrepreneurs. Okay, what are they doing that I can do differently, better, incredibly unique to make myself stand out? Because I don't want to be the 9th best podcast interviewing entrepreneurs back when I launched in 2012. And guess what? They were all doing 1 show per week or 2 shows per month. And I was like, that's a big miss, in my opinion, on a lot of shows, parts that were doing that, because I knew as a listener, I wanted much more quantity. I was driving to work 5 days a week, hitting the gym multiple. I wanted a daily show to feed my mind of an inspiring entrepreneur that was telling a meaningful story. So I said, why is there not a daily show interviewing entrepreneurs? That was a void that I found, Ty. And I filled that void. I became the first daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. What did that make me? That made me the best daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It made me the worst daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. It made me the only daily podcast interviewing entrepreneurs. And that is why I was able to win almost immediately and at a high level and maintain that going forward. So for anybody listening that wants to start a podcast or any kind of content creation, media, product, service, what is the unique niche that you are going to fill and bring to the equation that's not already there? And by the way, a lot of Amazon sellers, especially back in the day, did this very successfully. They went to some of those big top selling products and they looked at the 1-star reviews that had all the complaints about that product. And what do? They created a product that fixed those complaints, that fixed those mistakes. And they won as a result. How can you do that with your product, with your service, with your podcast, whatever that might be?
I love that. Very powerful advice. When you did launch, you and I both know it's hard to get guests in the very beginning, right? I mean, when you don't have a track record. So how did you go about that? When you started doing your very first interviews, I imagine, or it could be wrong, were you interviewing really high level entrepreneurs like you do now? Or what was your strategy to get started to be able to get the right people on the show?
So the answer was it was a numbers game. I had to go out and make the ask after ask after ask. I had to ask 100 people and get 90 to 95 no's for 5 yeses. And then I was able to build an initial bank doing that. And then I launched a show, and the show had some traction. And then at that point, the show was real. It was out there. It was meaningful. It was doing some good things. And then I was able to be very strategic and say, okay, Gary Vaynerchuk's launching a book this month. He's in uber promotion mode. He probably wouldn't talk to a no-name podcaster 6 months ago when he's not in uber promotion mode, but he is now. Same thing with Tim Ferriss. He was launching the 4-Hour Chef, I believe it was, or maybe it was 4-Hour Body. And then Seth Godin, same thing. I was being very strategic about when I was reaching out to these individuals when they were in promotion mode. And I said, hey, jump on a call with me. It's going to be 15 minutes long. I'm going to ask you questions that you're an expert in. At the end of the show, we'll promote your book and you can be off to your next thing. I know you're doing marketing right now. Entrepreneurs on Fire is a great opportunity for you to do that. I have an audience. Here's my listenership. Let's go. And it wasn't massive, but it wasn't much of their time either. I was able to wedge myself in there. And then at that point, guess what? I could now go to other individuals and say, hey, would you like to be on Entrepreneurs on Fire? I've had people like Tim Ferriss, Seth Godin, Gary Vaynerchuk on the show. And then once you have those names under your belt, people stop asking questions about the show because they're like, well, if those individuals have been on, and Tony Robbins and Barbara Corcoran, who's on TV, if they've been on the show, obviously they vetted the show, which some of them did, maybe some of them, a lot of them did not. But that's the assumption. And then it just becomes an easy yes for everybody else to come on the show because they're like, well, I'd love to be on a show that's featured those amazing individuals because I'm kind of putting myself in that same boat by doing just that. So it kind of became a no-brainer.
How did you get the show to be set on fire per se? Like, were you successful in getting those guys to promote the episode, or did you even want them to promote the episode?
That's a good question. And that was one of my early strategies that really did work. And it doesn't work in 2024, frankly, and I can tell you why in a little bit if you want. But in 2012, as I mentioned prior, there weren't that many podcasts that were out there. There was a handful, but a lot of these people had been on 0, 1, maybe 2 other podcast interviews before. Like it was kind of a newer thing. So that when the episode did go live and I emailed them and said, hey, your episode where you were strictly featured, you were the sole feature of the entire episode, is now live on Apple Podcasts, on all the other platforms that were out there back in those days. Here's the links to share with your audience. Here's some copy to post a tweet, to a Facebook message, a LinkedIn message. Here's some email copy if you want to just do a quick email to your newsletter. And not everybody did, but enough people did. And then when I was doing that 7 days a week, if 3, 4, 5 of people that week promoted the show to their audience, that built itself exponentially over time. And that was, this really awesome tool that was available to me back then. But again, that was 2012. And that's why you need to be taking advantage of things when it's early, when it's not oversaturated. Now those individuals have been on hundreds of shows and frankly, they get asked the exact same questions on every one of those shows. So they can't share with their audience because their audience has already heard them answer those questions a million times anyways. So they're not going to listen to it. So you have to be really strategic and go back to what I shared earlier, which is basically in a 1 sentence summation, become the number one solution to a real problem in this world. Because Ty, if you do that, if you become the number one solution to a real problem, people will beat a path to your doorstep because everybody wants the number one solution to their real problem. And they ignore the second best solution to infinity because nobody cares about that. They want the best. So create the best. And if you look at yourself and say, but I can't create the best solution to this problem because of this person or that competitor or all these things, then you're not niched down enough to where you can dominate the competition. Or as I was back in 2012, I was the only competition.
What is your strategy with guests now? Like, who do you think about? Who do you actually target as a potential guest for the show? Because, like you said, a lot's changed in the last 12 years. I don't even know. Well, actually, it's another interesting point. Is have you looked recently to see how many are now in the entrepreneur interview space? Like, there was none when you got in there. How many have copied you and tried to come in to this space? Have you looked at that recently?
I mean, a lot. And listen, I run the biggest podcasting course and community in the world, Podcasters Paradise. We train people every day to do that. Of course, I'm always stressing, do not create an imitation of Entrepreneurs on Fire because you will fail. There's no point on doing that. You should have a podcast that is focused on a topic that you're an expert in, that's going to deliver your business, yourself, direct revenue, direct clients, direct leads that are meaningful. So we teach and train people in very specific ways. It's not that, because a lot of things have changed over the years. You can't just drop a podcast out there and expect to get traction on it, nor should you. And honestly, nor is that very beneficial. Like, a lot of people have built massive audiences that mean nothing because they have no business behind that. So what good is that? That's why one thing that we do very proudly now for 12 years, for over 130 months in a row, is we've published our income report, how we make money, every dollar we make, every dollar we spend, every dollar we lose, like everything. We just publish it all because we want people to see what's working for us, what's not working for us. You can emulate our successes, you can avoid our failures, and hopefully draw some inspiration from that.
And I love that you do that, by the way.
Thank you.
What about for you guests now? Like, what criteria do you look at when interviewing now that the show's become as popular as it is? And you've been able to interview some phenomenal guests. So what do you look for now? Like, when you're out there deciding who's going to be on the show daily now, who are you looking for?
So here's the thing. I know that the most important thing with my show, which is established with an established audience, is making that audience happy, providing that audience value, because it's much more important to me for my listeners to tell their friends, their loved ones, their peers about the show than to try to get my guests to share the show, because again, that ship has kind of sailed. That was a strategy that worked, no longer. So you really want that word of mouth. So now my focus for my guests is, who are the people that really can provide meaningful, high impact value that my audience is going to be genuinely intrigued by and get real value from, and enjoy the conversation. And a lot of people tell me, they say, John, like, wow, that is crazy. You literally do 7 episodes per week. And not only do I do that, I have a video interview with every single guest as a pre-qualification before I give the green light for them to be on the show. Because frankly, and I've been doing that for years now. And the reason is, frankly, because there were times, and of course, this is going to happen when you interview over 300 people per year, where I got a couple personality duds. And by the way, that doesn't make them a bad person. They were great people and they were successful and they had a lot of good things going for them. But unfortunately, they made for a really poor guest. And if you have a poor guest, if you're boring, no matter how good the content that you're giving is, nobody's going to listen. Nobody's going to learn. So it didn't happen often, but it happened often enough where I was like, I really want a pre-qual with a video I just did one right before this call where I jumped on a call with this guy. He's up in Canada, runs a great business. I love his energy. He'll be on the show. Like he'll come on the show because I know like that this guy's going to bring the fire, the energy along with the value. And when you're doing an interview, you do need both.
You're one of the best interviewers. I don't think this is just my opinion. I think if you look at all the podcast interviews that are out there, you're one of the best I've ever seen. You've got to be one of the top ones out there. What are some tips and tactics that you've learned along the way to become obvious? A lot of practice. So everybody listening, watching, they if they want to get into podcasting, already are. They want to become a good interviewer. What are some of the things that you've learned that have helped you become as good of an interviewer as you are?
Well, you did state the obvious, but I need to restate it because it's the thing, which is putting in the reps. There's nothing that can ever replace that. The only reason the only reason that I became a good interviewer over the years is because I've done it at such a high frequency. I've interviewed 4,381 entrepreneurs. That's a massive number. I've been on hundreds and thousands of shows as a guest. I've been on stages, like you mentioned before. I put in the rep, I put in the time. Like a lot of people say, hey, John, I think I'm going to just start with like, an episode a week. And by the way, that's fine for people that's a part of their business and they just want this to be an addition to it. That's great. But I just want them to know like, okay, but listen, that can honestly help your business. And there's nothing that's negative that's going to come out of that. You'll meet cool people. You'll be putting out good content, but you're probably not going to become a good interviewer, but that's okay. You don't need to become a good interviewer necessarily if it's not the only thing you're doing. Because do you think that LeBron James practiced one time per week? Did Tiger Woods get on the golf course 4 times per month? Of course not. They got great. They became legends because they put in the reps, they put in the time. So you have to do that. Like that's the only way you're going to get better. You're going to get a little bit better every single time. And by the way, putting in reps is listening to Entrepreneurs on Fire and hearing how I interview people, how I interact with people, how I engage. I've studied the greats like Larry King, other like late night hosts are fantastic at this. Some of them are actually terrible, by the way, but some of them are really good. And you study them and you learn from them and you read about them. And, Jerry Seinfeld was great. Like he got asked the question all the time, Jerry, why are you so funny? How do you have so many good jokes? He said, I wrote 1 joke a day, minimum. Sometimes he wrote 10, but he said, I never went a day without writing 1 joke at a minimum. And there's a lot of comedians that never achieved his level because they would go weeks or months without writing a joke. And that just adds up because most of Jerry's jokes were not funny. He admits it. But when you write thousands of jokes, some of them are going to be great.
What kind of prep do you put into an interview? Do you do the prep yourself out of curiosity? You don't have to disclose that if you don't want to. But I'm sure.
Listen, let me break that down. So I think people that prep for interviews are fantastic. I know some of my dear friends that do, especially long form interviews. They spend hours prepping. They have teams that prep. I love all of that. Like that makes for great interviews and they kill it because of it. So I am for that. I'm also for the other end of the spectrum, which is me, which is zero prep. And the reason why I've decided to do zero prep is multifold. Number one, I'm doing 7 episodes a week. So to add prep on top of that just is makes my head want to explode. I mean, I'm already doing a mind-numbing amount of work. Number 2, and this is true, and this is a strategy that I love going into interviews with similar knowledge, if not the same knowledge about the topic and about the guest as my listener. Now, why? Because that makes me ask the questions that they're probably thinking as they're listening to that interview. And that's key because there's this thing called the curse of knowledge, and the curse of knowledge is real. It is real. When you know something, you have this subconscious and sometimes conscious assumption that other people know it because you know it. It's kind of like, you know that. Well, probably other people, a lot of other people know that, if not everybody. And most of the time you're wrong. So when I go in without knowledge, I don't have the curse of knowledge. And therefore, I ask questions because I'm curious and I go into interviews with that intention. I'm curious. I'm going to approach this interview with curiosity. And so I ask questions that some people listening might be like, well, that was a dumb question. And it might be dumb for them to have heard that question. But for 5%, for 95% of the listeners, or somewhere in between, it's a meaningful question. And I asked it for that reason because I genuinely had that question.
Phenomenal advice. Makes me think about what you do on your business side to help entrepreneurs do this. So give me a little bit of insight there. So what does your business look like to help somebody start, launch, grow, scale a podcast? What kind of things are you doing to help an entrepreneur there?
Well, specifically, we run the biggest course and community in the world, Podcasters Paradise, where people can join that course, that community, Podcasters Paradise, and have all the training, video tutorials they need, access to me in the Facebook group every single day, a live video call with me every single month. And we train people how to do that, how to create a podcast, how to launch that podcast, how to grow that podcast audience, and of course, how to monetize that podcast, which is very difficult. And by the way, I'm using the word podcast because that's where our focus is, but it's business in general as well. Because if you can come up with the idea for a podcast, you can insert coaching program, masterminds, product, service into that because it's a similar process. It's a similar path. And you mentioned my book earlier, The Common Path to Uncommon Success. That book is a 17-step roadmap to financial freedom and fulfillment. You can utilize that book to do a podcast, to do a SaaS product, to do a physical product, to start a coaching program. Like, it is the 17 timeless steps that I've learned from interviewing over 4,000 successful entrepreneurs about how they ran their business.
And I love that you do that. I think that it's phenomenal that you've learned this trade, you've become a real expert at it. And then what you do is you give back because that's just the way that you operate. Your life is service, and that you give back to help so many of us that are newer or that are still trying to find our way to be able to actually find that success. So just kudos to you. And I mean, you had to have helped thousands, if not tens of thousands of entrepreneurs launch or scale successfully their shows.
And I love the phrase, the ripple effect. And you can see that this lake behind me, this is real, actually. Let me see if I can get it better. Yeah, you can see that kind of lake sparkling behind me. And there's ripples in that lake. And that's what I look at every episode of Entrepreneurs on Fire. Like, it's me like throwing a pebble in that lake right there. And by the way, most of those ripples aren't going to affect anybody because they just won't. They won't listen to the episode. They won't this, they won't that. But those ripples will have impacts on something, on somebody, on some levels. And I'm throwing in one of those pebbles every single day. And so over the 12 years of 4,000 plus episodes, those ripples have become, to me, countless, countless acts of value that now somebody is doing something they never would have done if not for that interview I did back in 2014 with, fill in the blank entrepreneur. And now that person has a 250 person business that is delivering value to tens of thousands of people across the world. And I had a small part in that. And that's exciting to me.
What's your best piece of advice that we haven't covered that you would give anybody here that's looking to launch or to be able to scale their shows?
It's a Gandhi quote, which is be the change you want to see in this world. Because so many people walk around and they say, I'm going to complain about this today. I'm going to whine about that today. This is a problem. This is a challenge. This is an obstacle. This is a struggle. And they do nothing about it. At some point, you've got to take a stand and you've got to be the change that you keep complaining about in this world. And by the way, I complain about things every single day, and most of them I will never be the change to, and I shouldn't be the change to, and I won't be the change to. But I took a stance for one thing 12 years ago, and I'm really glad that I did. And I definitely have a few more of those in my lifetime ahead as well that I'm excited for. And I don't know what they are, but I'm going to eventually, maybe soon, maybe later, find something that's incredibly exciting and meaningful to me. And I'm going to take another stand for that thing and hopefully have success in that as well by providing value. So that would be my parting wisdom.
Where can everybody go that's listening here to be able to do a few things, to be able to follow the show? And then there are also people that want to grab your book. And then there's also people that want to learn more about you teaching and joining your community to basically be able to grow and accelerate their growth on their show.
eofire.com, eofire.com. That's our headquarters. Anywhere you listen to a podcast, Entrepreneurs on Fire or John Lee Dumas will get you to my podcast that comes out 7 days a week, and just providing value out there, Ty.
John, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
All right, so listen, as I always say, the knowledge doesn't really mean anything if you're not taking action, right? So the action to take, and luckily for you, there's only one, is go to eofire.com. That's eofire.com. And there's a few things that you're really going to want to pay attention to. You need to start following and listening to the episodes. The episodes are short, and everyone is power-packed full of so much actionable information that can make a serious difference in your life. If you haven't listened to Entrepreneurs on Fire, you have to go check this out. The second thing is make sure you grab John's book. He literally is giving you the step-by-step formula to be successful. So many people, I don't know what statistics are, but I would imagine 90-95% of podcast people that launch fail, right? If you want to succeed at anything, you follow the person that has the path that's already been where you are, that is where you want to go, right? And that is exactly what John has accomplished. One of a very, very, very small amount of people in this world that's actually done it. And again, you can get that at eofire.com and also learn more about being part of his community. He's got live coaching sessions. He's got a group and a community that you actually be part of. Got the videos, every training on almost anything, probably everything you could think about that you've run into obstacle-wise. So you might as well as actually shortcut, go to the front of the line for success and get the actual step-by-step formula to succeed. And he does that in his community as well. And it all happens in one place, eofire.com. So make sure you check it out right now, eofire.com. Make sure you join the community. Make sure you grab his book and make sure you start listening regularly to Entrepreneurs on Fire. Thanks very much for tuning in. Take care. Have a great day.